A retired police K-9 suddenly blocks a foster mom at the school gate, growling, unmoving, and staring straight at her son's backpack. What was hidden inside that made this hero dog risk everything to stop them. Here's what happened, but before we get into the story, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're watching from. A crisp morning breeze drifted across the schoolyard as children flooded through the front gates, laughing and sprinting past parents and security. Dana, a 32-year-old foster mom, reached for little Kevin's hand, ready to escort him toward his kindergarten class. But before she could take a step, K9 Thor, a retired German Shepherd police dog now assigned as the school's therapy and security companion, lunged from his post and planted himself in front of them, teeth bared, growling low, muscles coiled like a spring. Dana froze. So did everyone around her. This was not a drill. Thor had always been calm, watchful, loyal, but never aggressive. His handler, Officer Reed, who had just stepped aside to chat with the principal, turned at the sound of the growl and sprinted over, calling Thor's name with a sharpness in his voice that made Dana's pulse skip. But Thor didn't budge. His eyes, amber and sharp, stayed locked on Kevin's small blue backpack, which dangled from one shoulder, swinging slightly with the wind. Kevin stood quietly, not crying, not moving, just clutching Dana's arm and staring at the ground as if he knew. Dana's heart pounded. "What's wrong with him?" she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. But Officer Reed heard and immediately pulled his radio to his lips, barking rapid instructions to lock down the front gate. Teachers began ushering kids back toward the school in a calm but firm line, trying to hide their concern behind practiced smiles. Dana knelt beside Kevin and tried to take the backpack off, but Thor snarled, low and guttural, snapping the air with a warning that made her pull back in instinctual fear. "He's alerting," Reed muttered, kneeling beside the dog, one hand gripping his harness. "He's not just being difficult, he thinks there's a threat." Dana's mouth went dry. "A threat? What kind of threat? He's just a kid." But Thor had never been wrong. During his service years, he'd sniffed out weapons hidden under car seats, narcotics stitched into dolls, even chemical traces in parcels designed to bypass security. Whatever he was sensing now, it wasn't minor. Kevin stayed quiet, not reacting, not blinking, not looking at anyone. It was the stillness in him that unnerved Dana the most, like he was used to moments like this. A nearby teacher rushed over and crouched to examine the bag from a distance. She gently reached out, but again Thor growled, pressing his body even closer to the boy, as if ready to shield him from the world. "Let me," Officer Reed said, reaching slowly into his vest pocket to pull out a thick protective glove. "We're going to treat this like the real thing." He moved with steady, practiced care, as if any sudden movement might ignite something worse. Dana looked around. Parents were watching from behind fences, phones in their hands, filming, whispering, wondering. But none of them knew Kevin's story. Not like she did. Not like Thor, somehow, seemed to. And in that moment, as Reed slowly reached for the zipper of Kevin's bag, Dana's breath caught in her throat. Because something in her gut told her that everything was about to change. 3 months earlier, Dana had taken in 5-year-old Kevin after he was removed from a volatile household. Timid, silent, and with dark bruises that made Dana's heart ache, Kevin rarely spoke. He flinched at loud voices, froze at sudden movements, and avoided eye contact like it was dangerous. Dana had fostered before, seen trauma in the eyes of children, but Kevin was different. He wasn't just scared, he was watchful, like he expected danger to crawl from every corner. The only time that changed was when Thor walked into the room. It was the school's counselor who first suggested Kevin spend mornings with the therapy dog. Thor had retired from active duty after saving 2 hostages during a standoff that left him with a bullet lodged near his hip. Too risky to remove, but not enough to keep him from serving in safer ways. He was a legend among officers, a warrior turned guardian, and in his new role, he'd been placed at the elementary school to help kids navigate trauma. On the first day Kevin met him, he didn't flinch when Thor approached. He didn't shrink or turn away. He just sat there, legs crossed on the floor, while Thor padded silently over and lowered his massive head into the boy's lap. Dana watched through the window as Kevin's fingers slowly, almost uncertainly, began to stroke the dog's thick fur. It was the first time she'd seen peace on his face. From that moment, they were inseparable. Kevin would sit with Thor during recess, eat lunch beside him, even nap in the therapy room with his tiny hand resting on the canine's back. Thor responded in kind, tail wagging when Kevin arrived, growling low when strangers came too close, positioning himself between the boy and the door without instruction. Teachers joked about the bond, calling it the little knight and his armored steed, but Dana saw something deeper. Thor didn't just like Kevin. He protected him with the same fierce intensity he'd once shown on the battlefield. Dana had once asked Officer Reed about it. It's rare, he admitted, glancing at Thor. He's loyal to all the kids, but this is different. He chose Kevin. Sometimes these days, they know things we don't. And Dana believed that, because Thor had started reacting before Kevin showed any signs of distress, barking sharply just before Kevin shut down during a math test, nudging the boy gently when he was about to cry. There was something primal in the way Thor watched over him, like his very presence was a promise. No harm would come without going through him first. Dana had begun to rely on that, to feel a sense of safety she couldn't provide on her own. But now, standing in the schoolyard with Thor growling and Kevin frozen, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit before. Thor wasn't just a companion. He was a sentinel. And if he was sounding the alarm now, it meant the threat wasn't past. It was already here. That morning, before heading to school, Dana had received a call from an unknown number. She'd been packing Kevin's lunch, slicing up his apple the way he liked, when her phone buzzed against the countertop. No caller ID. Her thumb hovered for a second. Then she answered, expecting a telemarketer or a missed appointment reminder. But what she heard instead chilled her to the bone. "See you at drop-off," the voice said. Calm, slow, unnervingly polite. A man's voice. Smooth, but hollow, like someone reading from a script they'd rehearsed too many times. Then silence. He hung up. No name, no explanation. Just that. Dana stood frozen for a beat, heart thudding in her chest as the dial tone echoed like a scream through the empty kitchen. She tried to dismiss it, told herself it was a mistake, a prank, maybe a wrong number. But a sick feeling crept into her gut and refused to leave. She glanced at Kevin, who was sitting at the table with his backpack beside him, carefully peeling the crust off his toast like he always did. His face was blank, his eyes cast down. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" she asked, forcing cheer into her voice. Kevin nodded once, barely perceptible. Dana smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. The timing of the call was too perfect, too direct, and something about the voice, that deliberate tone, it felt familiar. As she drove Kevin to school, she kept checking the rearview mirror, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over the road, and every passing car made her shoulders tense. She hated this feeling, this slow-growing dread crawling up her spine. It wasn't the first time danger had worn a polite voice. Not with Kevin. She remembered the day she first got the call from Child Protective Services. The details were vague, but the caseworker's voice had been tight. Kevin had been found locked in a storage closet while his father was in the next room, ranting to himself, high on paranoia and fumes. No one knew the full story, but there were whispers about explosives, about past military service, about dishonor and discharge. The file had been scrubbed, redacted, incomplete. Dana never got the whole truth, only shadows. But as she parked outside the school that morning, she looked at her phone again, stared at the number on her call log, and the nausea returned. "We're safe now," she'd said to Kevin when he first came home with her. "No one's going to hurt you again." She had meant it. But as they walked toward the gate, as Thor began to growl and the world seemed to shift around them, she realized something terrifying. The past doesn't knock when it comes back. It slithers in with a smile and waits for the exact right moment to strike. And this morning, at drop-off, it had arrived right on schedule. As Thor continued to growl, refusing to let Dana and Kevin pass, a nearby teacher, Ms. Geller, hurried over, her face tight with concern. "Something's wrong," she whispered, Her voice strained as she knelt beside Kevin, her eyes flicking between the dog and the boy. Thor's nose pressed against the backpack again, insistent, then snapped back to Dana, then back to the bag with a low rumble in his chest that seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath their feet. Dana's hands trembled as she reached for the straps, gently sliding them from Kevin's small shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, trying to sound calm, but her voice cracked on the last word. Kevin didn't resist. He just stood there, unmoving, his arms dangling at his sides like he wasn't even present anymore. Dana handed the bag to Ms. Geller, who accepted it slowly, cautiously, as if it were already ticking. She placed it gently on the ground and opened the top zipper with deliberate care. Her breath caught, then turned into a scream that shattered the fragile silence. Nestled between a Spider-Man coloring book and a Ziploc bag with a crustless sandwich was a black object, rectangular, crudely wrapped in electrical tape. Wires coiled like snakes from the sides, twisted into a compact mess of copper and solder, connected to a cell phone duct taped to a battery pack. "Oh my God," Ms. Geller gasped, backing away as her face drained of color. Dana's heart nearly stopped. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed a nearby bench to steady herself. Officer Reed, already moving before the scream fully left Ms. Geller's throat, pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside the backpack, his training kicking in. "Nobody move," he barked, voice sharp, commanding. "Everyone back up, now!" Teachers began ushering children away from the scene, their voices a mix of panic and performance as they tried to make the evacuation sound like a game. "We're heading back inside, kiddos. Single file. Let's go, nice and calm." But nothing felt calm. The air had changed. It was heavier, electric with fear. Thor stayed planted next to Kevin, his body rigid, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the device. Reed didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled out his radio, voice tight with urgency. "We have a suspected IED in a student's backpack. I repeat, possible IED. Lockdown protocols in effect. Bomb squad en route." Dana stared at the backpack as if it might explode just from being looked at. Her hands shook violently, and tears filled her eyes as she turned to Kevin. "Did you put that in there?" she whispered, desperate for something, anything. Kevin didn't respond. He just looked up at her with wide, unreadable eyes and said nothing. It was the nothing that terrified her most. Officer Reed stood, stepping between the bag and the boy. "We need to secure the area," he said, his voice now edged with steel. "And we need to find out who packed that bag." Dana's mind reeled. She had packed it. Every item. Every morning. And that thing was not there, which meant someone had slipped it in after, and whoever had done it wanted Kevin to carry a bomb to school. As Thor continued to growl, refusing to let Dana and Kevin pass, a nearby teacher, Ms. Geller, hurried over, her face tight with concern. "Something's wrong," she whispered, her voice strained as she knelt beside Kevin, her eyes flicking between the dog and the boy. Thor's nose pressed against the backpack again, insistent, then snapped back to Dana, then back to the bag with a low rumble in his chest that seemed to vibrate through the concrete beneath their feet. Dana's hands trembled as she reached for the straps, gently sliding them from Kevin's small shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, trying to sound calm, but her voice cracked on the last word. Kevin didn't resist. He just stood there, unmoving, his arms dangling at his sides like he wasn't even present anymore. Dana handed the bag to Ms. Geller, who accepted it slowly, cautiously, as if it were already ticking. She placed it gently on the ground and opened the top zipper with deliberate care. Her breath caught, then turned into a scream that shattered the fragile silence. Nestled between a Spider-Man coloring book and a Ziploc bag with a crustless sandwich was a black object. Rectangular, crudely wrapped in electrical tape. Wires coiled like snakes from the sides, twisted into a compact mess of copper and solder, connected to a cell phone duct taped to a battery pack. "Oh my God," Ms. Geller gasped, backing away as her face drained of color. Dana's heart nearly stopped. Her knees buckled, and she grabbed a nearby bench to steady herself. Officer Reed, already moving before the scream fully left Ms. Geller's throat, pushed through the crowd and dropped to his knees beside the backpack, his training kicking in. "Nobody move," he barked, voice sharp, commanding. "Everyone back up, now!" Teachers began ushering children away from the scene, their voices a mix of panic and performance, as they tried to make the evacuation sound like a game. "We're heading back inside, kiddos, single file. Let's go, nice and calm." But nothing felt calm. The air had changed. It was heavier, electric with fear. Thor stayed planted next to Kevin, his body rigid, ears pinned back, eyes locked on the device. Reed didn't touch it. Instead, he pulled out his radio, voice tight with urgency. "We have a suspected IED in a student's backpack. I repeat, possible IED. Lockdown protocols in effect. Bomb squad en route." Dana stared at the backpack as if it might explode just from being looked at. Her hands shook violently, and tears filled her eyes as she turned to Kevin. "Did you put that in there?" she whispered, desperate for something, anything. Kevin didn't respond. He just looked up at her with wide, unreadable eyes and said nothing. It was the nothing that terrified her most. Officer Reed stood, stepping between the bag and the boy. "We need to secure the area," he said, his voice now edged with steel, "and we need to find out who packed that bag." Dana's mind reeled. She had packed it, every item, every morning, and that thing was not there, which meant someone had slipped it in after, and whoever had done it wanted Kevin to carry a bomb to school. As investigators scrambled to retrace every step, Dana was pulled into a quiet conference room just beyond the school's administrative office, her mind still reeling, her hands cold and clammy despite the sweat on her back. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt final, and a man in a dark suit sat across from her, a federal badge clipped to his belt and a laptop already open. His voice was calm, too calm, the kind used when delivering devastating news wrapped in clinical terms. "We've confirmed the identity of the man who called you this morning," he said, eyes fixed on the screen, fingers tapping quickly. "His name is William Trent, Kevin's biological father." Dana's mouth went dry. She had seen the name before, briefly on Kevin's intake paperwork, though most of the file had been redacted, labeled sensitive. "Trent was an explosives technician in the Army," the agent continued, sliding a printed page across the table. "Brilliant but volatile, dishonorably discharged after a domestic incident involving chemical materials. Served a sentence in federal prison for illegal arms trafficking. He was released 6 months ago to a halfway house in Missouri." Dana stared at the paper, at the grainy photo of a man with sunken eyes and a ghost of a smirk on his lips. She felt her stomach twist. "And now," she whispered. The agent exhaled. "Vanished last night, cut off his ankle monitor, left behind a room with dismantled electronics, chemical residue, and a wall covered in surveillance photos of Kevin." Dana's knees buckled, and she gripped the table to stay upright. Her thoughts spun like a carousel spiraling out of control. She'd followed every rule. She'd passed every check. She'd trusted the system when it said Kevin was safe. But now the truth slammed into her with the weight of a freight train. Kevin hadn't been removed from danger. He'd just been hidden by people who believed paperwork could stop a man like Trent. The agent leaned forward. He's smart, he's angry, and he knows how to make things that don't get noticed until it's too late. "We believe he planted the device in Kevin's backpack to test the system, to see how close he could get." Dana felt the room tilt. "Using his own son?" she choked out, voice cracking. The agent didn't flinch. "People like Trent don't think like we do. To him, Kevin's a message, a symbol, and we think he's not done." The words sank like stones in Dana's chest. All the nights she'd watched Kevin sleep, all the meals where he never looked up, all the times he flinched when someone knocked too loud. He hadn't been healing. He'd been bracing. He'd known deep down that the monster wasn't gone, just waiting. And now, as sirens wailed in the distance and a school emptied under lockdown, Dana realized that the promise of safety meant nothing against a man with rage in his heart and knowledge in his hands. The war hadn't ended. It had only just begun. What no one could understand was how Thor had known. The metal detectors at the school entrance had cleared Kevin without issue, and the device inside the backpack had been cleverly disguised, its components so subtle that even the bomb squad later admitted it might have passed a standard sweep. But Thor, retired, aging, with a bullet still buried near his hip, had sensed it within seconds, long before anyone even suspected danger. It wasn't just a bark or a raised ear. It was a full body, ears flat, teeth bared warning, rooted in something far more instinctive than training. And when questioned, even the experts could only offer part of the truth. A canine explosive specialist later explained that dogs like Thor were trained to detect compounds down to parts per trillion, that their noses were thousands of times more sensitive than human made devices. He probably caught trace elements of PTN or RDX, the specialist said, pointing to a diagram no one cared about. Residual fingerprints may be something embedded in the canvas from the handling process. It's rare, but it's possible. But Dana knew there was more to it. Because Thor hadn't just reacted to the bag, he reacted to Kevin. To the way the boy's body tensed as they neared the gate, to the subtle drop in his shoulders, the shallow breaths he took when they approached the threshold. It was as if Thor had read fear pulsing off the child like heat from pavement. Not fear of the school or the noise. Not general unease. This was different. This was dread. The kind Thor had seen on crime scenes and war zones and hostage rooms when he was still on the front lines. Dana remembered one morning, 2 weeks after Kevin had moved in, when she had spilled a pan in the kitchen, and the crash of metal had startled Kevin so badly he dove under the table and refused to come out. It wasn't until Thor padded over, crawled beneath with him, and lay still beside the boy that Kevin began to breathe again. From that day on, Thor didn't leave his side. The bond between them had grown without words, a silent contract forged in shared understanding of wounds too deep to name. So when Kevin's body betrayed a fear even he didn't speak, Thor acted, not as a machine, not as a tool, but as something far older, an instinct-driven protector, a creature who loved without conditions and defended without hesitation. Officer Reed would later tell reporters that Thor had saved over a dozen lives that day. But to Dana, it was simpler than that. He had saved one little boy from being used as a weapon. He had seen what no one else did. Not just the bomb, but the terror hiding behind Kevin's quiet eyes. And in doing so, he reminded every adult in that building what true vigilance looks like. Not wires and screens, not scanners or policies, but listening, watching, loving fiercely enough to act before it's too late. With Kevin's father identified in surveillance footage, revealing him loitering near the school earlier that morning, hood up, hands tucked, eyes scanning the crowd like a man rehearsing his final act, law enforcement wasted no time launching a full-scale manhunt. Streets were sealed, helicopters combed the sky, and tactical teams spread out through the surrounding neighborhoods. But it wasn't a drone or a SWAT team that found him first. It was Thor. The moment they showed Thor the security footage, just a still frame of Trent's profile from the parking lot, something inside the dog seemed to ignite. His ears perked, body tensed, and before Officer Reed could fully secure the leash, Thor surged forward with a sudden growl, nostrils flaring, tail stiff with purpose. "He's got something," Reed muttered, barely holding on as Thor pulled them down the back perimeter of the school grounds toward the thick wooded area that bordered the playground. The terrain was uneven, roots crisscrossed beneath damp leaves, and every branch they pushed through felt like a veil into darker uncertainty. Dana, though told to stay behind, trailed at a distance with Kevin clutched in her arms, heart pounding louder than the wind. The further they went, the quieter it became. No birds, no cars, just the crunch of boots and the soft growl rumbling from Thor's throat. Then, without warning, Thor stopped, his head lifted, nose twitching, body frozen like a statue. 1 second later, he bolted. He broke free from Reed's grip and tore through the underbrush like a rocket, barking so fiercely it echoed through the trees in sharp, brutal cracks. Officers gave chase, shouting commands, radios flaring to life as they homed in on his direction. And then they saw it, a camouflage tarp, barely noticeable beneath fallen leaves and brush, a crude blind set against a hollow tree. Beneath it knelt a man, lean and jittery, fingers dancing over the wires of a second device nestled in his lap. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and when he turned at the sound of Thor's bark, he didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for the trigger. But he never made it. Thor launched from the clearing like a missile. Mouth open, teeth flashing, he hit Trent square in the chest, knocking him backward, jaws clamping down on his arm as the man screamed and thrashed. Officers poured in, weapons raised, orders shouted, boots pounding the earth around them. But Thor didn't let go. He held firm until Trent was pinned, disarmed, and cuffed, the device yanked from his hands with trembling precision. Dana arrived just in time to see Thor limping back to Reed, panting, sides heaving, one paw bleeding from a sharp branch, but eyes still burning with determination. Kevin said nothing, just reached out a small hand to touch the dog's muzzle, and for the first time that day, he smiled. In that tangled forest with danger diffused and a monster in chains, it was not a weapon that had ended the chase. It was loyalty. It was instinct. It was Thor. In the struggle that followed, time fractured into sharp, chaotic fragments. The forest erupted with motion. Officers shouting commands, boots pounding against wet earth, the rustle of leaves split by the sudden, gut-wrenching crack of a gunshot. One sound cut through it all. Thor's yelp, short and pained, like the gasp of something too strong to fall, but not immune to pain. Dana heard it before she saw it, and her heart seized in her chest. She clutched Kevin tighter, instinct overriding protocol, as she pushed past the line of officers holding her back. Ahead, Thor was on the ground, his body slumped partially over Trent's writhing frame, jaws still locked around the man's forearm, blood trickling from his flank in a steady, dark line. The shot had come from Trent. He'd managed to free a concealed weapon, small and desperate, and fired in blind panic as Thor took him down. But the dog didn't fall away. He didn't retreat. Even wounded, he had remained where he was, anchoring the threat until human hands could finish the job. Trent was wrestled to the ground, his weapon kicked away, wrists zip-tied, face buried in the dirt. Thor released his grip only when he felt the tension of danger finally snap. He staggered sideways, collapsing to one knee, breathing shallow, fur matted with blood. That's when Dana and Kevin reached him. The boy broke free from her arms and rushed to Thor's side, dropping to his knees beside the massive dog without a word. And as Kevin leaned forward, tiny hands brushing gently over Thor's muzzle, he whispered words no one had ever heard him say before. "You saved me." His voice trembled, barely above a breath, but it was clear and true, like the unlocking of a door long sealed shut. Then came the moment that stopped everyone cold. Kevin wrapped his arms around Thor's thick neck and pulled him close, sobbing quietly into his fur. He didn't flinch. He didn't retreat. He let himself feel. For the first time since Dana had taken him in, Kevin let someone hold him. And more importantly, he held back. Officers lowered their weapons. Paramedics waited in reverent silence. Even the wind seemed to hush around them. It wasn't just a boy hugging a dog. It was a heart learning to trust again. A spirit recognizing safety not through words, but through action. Thor, though weak and in pain, lifted his head just enough to nuzzle against Kevin's cheek. His tail giving a faint thump against the ground. He knew what he'd done. He knew who he had done it for. And Dana, kneeling beside them both, with tears spilling down her cheeks, finally let herself believe what she hadn't dared to hope. That maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of a terrifying day. Maybe it was the beginning of something stronger. A life rebuilt, not just with safety, but with love forged in fire. Thor had taken the bullet. Thor had taken the risk. Thor had been the shield. 2 weeks later, the school reopened with tighter security, extra cameras, reinforced protocols, and new faces at every gate. But amid all the changes, one constant remained. Thor, stitched, shaved, and healing. The old warrior walked a little slower now, favoring his side where the bullet had carved a brutal path through muscle, but his spirit hadn't dimmed. Each morning, He padded faithfully into Mrs. Langley's kindergarten classroom and lay beside Kevin's desk like a silent sentinel, eyes watchful, ears flicking at every unexpected sound. The children knew not to run too fast near him, or to raise their voices suddenly, not because Thor would ever hurt them, but because they all understood in their small, unspoken way that this dog had seen things they hadn't, and done things no one else could. Kevin, once quiet and withdrawn, now sat straighter in his seat. He spoke more. He played. He laughed. And he never stopped touching Thor, whether a hand in his fur, a foot gently resting near his belly, or a whispered word only the dog ever seemed to hear. The transformation was so visible, so complete, that the school decided to mark it with something permanent. A special assembly was called. The gymnasium decorated with banners and balloons, folding chairs lined up in careful rows. Parents filled the seats, local reporters held cameras aloft, and uniformed officers stood near the stage, faces solemn and proud. Dana stood with Kevin near the front, her fingers laced through his tiny hand, her heart swelling with something bigger than relief, something like awe. When Thor was led to the stage, the applause began, not loud and thunderous, but reverent, rising slowly like a wave of gratitude that crested in the air and broke over every heart in the room. Officer Reed stepped forward with a small, polished box. Inside lay a medal engraved with a single word, Guardian. As he knelt and gently fastened it to Thor's collar, the crowd held its breath. Thor didn't bark. He didn't move. He just sat, tall, regal, calm, watching, waiting, as if the honor didn't matter, only the boy beside him did. The principal offered a few words, then handed the microphone to Kevin, who looked out at the crowd with wide eyes and took a nervous step forward. Dana knelt to whisper encouragement, but he didn't need it. He raised the mic with two small hands and said softly, "Thor is my safe place." That was it. 5 words. But they hit like a bolt of lightning. In the hush that followed, more powerful than applause, every adult in that room felt something unspoken rise between them, an understanding that safety wasn't always walls or rules or locks. Sometimes safety had fur. Sometimes it had scars. Sometimes it walked on 4 legs and stood between a child and the worst the world could offer. Thor didn't need to be called a hero. He just needed to be there. And he was. Always. Because he wasn't just a dog, he was everything Kevin never had and everything he would always need.